All right, we are back in the FITSNews studio for another edition of your Week in Review. A lot to cover. We're going to dive back into the Murdoch saga. Some big court developments this week in multiple different Murdoch-related cases. We're going to bring you up to speed on the very latest there. I'm also going to sit down with our research director, Jen Wood. We covered just an unspeakable tragedy this last week. We want to bring you the latest on that, a wedding that went tragically awry due to a drunk driver. We're going to walk through that and efforts to make sure that the system in South Carolina works to hold those responsible accountable. In addition to that, folks, we're going to talk about some Cheer Incorporated developments, a big case out of Texas. We covered this last week, but our Director of Special Projects, Dylan Nolan, and Jim Wood are going to sit down and bring you the latest on the big Navarro suit out of Texas. This is probably the highest profile of all the cheer lawsuits that have been filed over the last few months. We're going to dig into that. And last but not least, presidential politics, people. Here in South Carolina, the race is starting to heat up. We're going to tell you about our interview with one of the presidential contenders who's vying for votes here in early voting South Carolina. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. All right, so we're going to start this week with the Murdochs, Dim Murdochs. Back in the news, obviously a lot of folks thought that this story would just vanish with the double homicide convictions and sentencing back in March of this year, but the story continues to move forward. There's so many angles to it, so many different cases moving forward. The statewide grand jury continuing to investigate this man, this institution down in the South Carolina Low Country that wielded such power for over a century down there in the South Carolina 14th Judicial Circuit. The main event, obviously the double homicide trial of convicted killer Alex Murdaugh, who was found guilty of murdering his wife and his son back in June of 2021 on the family property known as Mizell. Obviously his conviction, his sentencing, huge news, international news. But the case is tied to it. The deaths tied to this family, linked to this family, even tangentially in some cases, have continued to drive media narratives, have continued to draw attention from all over the country. Obviously, the big one of those, the Stephen Smith story, which this news outlet, in the weeks following that double homicide trial, we have been putting out tons of investigatory files related to Stephen Smith, been conducting interviews with those who know the case better than anyone else, just driving that story, continuing to get that out there for you to see, for you to make your decisions about, was that murder tied to the Murdochs or not? But this week, the Murdoch murder that's been generating all the buzz, the 2018 death of Gloria Satterfield. Now, Satterfield was the Murdoch family's longtime housekeeper, and she came to Mizell, the site of the double homicide, on the morning of February 2nd, 2018. Now, according to Alex Murdaugh, she came there to pick up a paycheck, which is very significant. We're going to get to that in a minute. But on her way into the house, again, according to Alex Murdaugh, she was tripped by the family dogs as she was coming up the 8 steps on the front porch of the main house at Mizell, fell backward, fell violently, in fact, gashed her head, suffered serious head trauma, and a little over 3 weeks later passed away in a North Charleston hospital. Now, this story was told by Murdoch to an insurance investigator, and clips from that interview first appeared in the big Murdoch Murders documentary, the Southern Scandal, the Netflix documentary. They were the first ones to put this information out there. We later got a copy of the entire video, posted it to FITSNews.com. You can still Google that, read that on FITSNews, or listen to that rather if you want. But this case, again, everything is hinged on that version of events, that acknowledgement by Alex Murdaugh, who told the investigators that Gloria Satterfield, in a moment of lucidity in the aftermath of this horrific fall, leaned in and whispered to him at a time when no one else heard it. No one else heard this, but leaned in and whispered to Alex Murdaugh that, yes, it was the dogs. The dogs tripped me, she allegedly told Alex Murdaugh. So why are we talking about this week? Let's unwind this and unpack this a little bit. Earlier this week, an attorney by the name of Sarah Azari tweeted an excerpt from one of the latest pleadings in a case involving Alec Murdaugh and the insurance company that paid out big bucks in connection with Gloria Satterfield's death. Millions of dollars, people. And we're going to talk about these millions here in a second. But Sarah Azari pointed to a court filing in connection with that case in which Murdoch at long last acknowledged that that story wasn't true. Now, this has long been suspected by those following this case. Here at FITSNews, we've published several stories calling into question Alec Murdaugh's version of events about the dogs causing this fall. Because here's the thing. If Gloria Satterfield had a medical incident which caused her to fall, a stroke or some other medical emergency that caused her to fall, Alec Murdaugh has no liability. Similarly, if Gloria Satterfield were on her way to work for the Murdaughs that day, as opposed to just picking up a check, then that fall would have been a workers' comp situation. But according to Alec Murdaugh, again, those two key things, she was there to pick up a check and the dogs caused her to fall. Because of those two things, again, allegedly, this is now a personal liability situation, which Murdoch then manipulated, again, to rip millions of dollars off of people who we thought were entitled to a recovery, the Satterfield family. But if what Azari says is true, if Murdoch in fact lied, then this whole thing is up in the air, isn't it? And let's talk about some of these millions. I mentioned them earlier. Attorneys Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter recovered more than $7 million in legal actions tied to this incident. Pretty impressive. They're good lawyers, very good lawyers. And in addition to that over $7 million, there's a $4.3 million confession of judgment from Alec Murdaugh, which has already been approved by a court, which means we're talking, again, over $11 million here. Big money. But it all hinges on that narrative about the dogs causing the fall. So let's dig into that a little bit. Azari's tweet just exploded, and unfortunately, well, let me back this up. Let's talk about Sarah Azari for a minute. I get along great with her. I've always had a good relationship with her. I like her. I think she's witty. She's sharp. She's also, like Bland and Richter, a very good attorney. But she has garnered some infamy in Murdoch circles because she has been perceived by many, and not without justification, as being very pro-Murdoch, pro-family. Very close with Jim Griffin and some of Alec Murdaugh's attorneys. So a lot of folks have discounted some of what she said because they perceive her to be a Murdoch family fangirl, if you will. But again, I've always, from the beginning of this story, whether you're on one side or you support one side or the other, I've encouraged people not to pick sides. Like the Stephen Smith story, just follow the facts. Follow the facts. Don't pick a team. Follow the facts. Allow yourself to be convinced by the truth, not by one side or the other. So in this case, similar to the Stephen Smith case, we're at a key point, where we need to be guided by the truth. And I wanted to, again, all due respect to Eric Bland, he's done a great job on behalf of his clients. He's done what he needs to do on behalf of his clients. Same with Ronnie Richter. But there was some criticism that Bland threw back at those who took note of this situation about this confession from Alec Murdaugh, calling them gutless, saying that they were attacking the Satterfield heirs. And I need to take issue with Eric Bland on this point, because this is a problem in this case. Too often, those who are profiting off of this story get very upset when people challenge any part of their efforts, any part of their advocacy. It becomes personal. People get blocked on social media. People get hypersensitive. And I think that's what happened in this case with Eric Bland, because here's the thing. As good of a lawyer as Eric Bland is, he is in a situation now with this revelation from Sarah Azari in this case, where we have to suspend all disbelief as it relates to the truthfulness of Alec Murdaugh. Seriously, we have to stop for a moment and believe that for all the lies Alec Murdaugh has told on the stand at his trial, leading up to the trial, in the fleecing of nearly $10 million off his clients, hundreds and thousands of lies that this man has told, we now have to, again, suspend disbelief and assume that in that interview with those insurance investigators, that he for one time told the truth about what happened to Gloria Satterfield. And not only that, we have to suspend disbelief further and assume that this truth was told only to Alec Murdaugh, only when he was listening. Gloria Satterfield's final conscious moments, if you will. This is the last thing she said to Alec Murdaugh. No one else heard it but him. And we have to further suspend disbelief that this one truth was a multi-million dollar payday for Murdoch. And now for Eric Bland. Folks, that is not how it works. We don't get to pick and choose truth. We don't get to call someone liar, liar, pants on fire, as Bland has done with Murdoch in this case, yet rely on him to be our one and only witness to this one truth, which again is a $11+ million payday. So again, all due respect there, we got to call truth out for what it is. And in this case, I don't know if you can suspend disbelief on that, but I thought there was a high level of cognitive dissonance on the part of Attorney Bland in remarking on this case. But I'm going to leave that for you guys to decide because, again, that's this case, the Stephen Smith case, all of it. It's up to you to make that call. But again, here at FITSNews, we're going to put all these perspectives out and let you decide. All right, so the Sarah Azari, Eric Bland back and forth, it wasn't the only big Murdoch news that transpired this week. There were developments in the civil case, the big boat crash case, the wrongful death case filed by the family of the late Mallory Beach. And again, this is really the moment that began the unraveling of this entire story. This was the tragedy which launched the Murdoch franchise, if you will, the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. It all began the early morning hours of February 24, 2019, when a boat, 17-foot center console fishing boat owned by Alec Murdaugh, piloted allegedly by Paul Murdoch, slammed into a piling of the Archers Creek Bridge in Beaufort County. Mallory Beach thrown from the boat. Upon impact, her body found days later by a local fisherman. But this was the story, again, that really launched this saga. It was the one that propelled the Murdochs to the statewide stage. It was the one that finally, at long last, all the gears, all the levers that this family had pulled for over a century, it all came to a screeching halt with this case because finally, for the first time, there was so much light on this family, so much light on this case, that all the moves that they pulled in the past no longer available to them in this case. The wrongful death suit, though, doesn't just name the Murdochs. There's another defendant in this case, powerful convenience store owner Greg Parker from Savannah, Georgia, and his chain of Parker's convenience stores. They are also defendants in this lawsuit because some of the alcohol purchased by Paul Murdoch prior to this crash was purchased at a Parker's convenience store. Now this week, in a Lexington County courtroom, attorneys for Parker's made the argument that they should be removed from this lawsuit altogether. They moved for what's called a motion of summary judgment, which means they should be dismissed without this case even going to trial because, according to them, the case against them is so weak. Now, attorney Mark Tinsley, who represents the family of the late Mallory Beach, pushed back very hard against that, arguing that Parker's was negligent in its duties, that they should never have sold this alcohol to Paul Murdoch because he presented them with an ID belonging to his brother. They claimed that he's over a foot shorter than his brother. There's no way he should have been sold this alcohol on that fateful evening of February 23rd, hours before this crash. Now, this is one of those cases that if you followed FITSNews for some time, we've written about it extensively. There have been so many motions, so many acrimonious legal battles. In fact, this case has sparked an entirely separate lawsuit due to allegations of discovery violations on both sides. Both sides, not only the Parker's folks who've engaged in some truly despicable tactics here over the course of this litigation, but also some allegations against Mark Tinsley, the Beach family attorney, some tactics that he's allegedly employed. So we've been following all of this, but this week, Circuit Court Judge Daniel Hall, who has been in charge of all these civil proceedings, heard arguments from Parkers arguing that they should be tossed off this case. Their argument, very simple. We didn't do anything wrong. We've been cleared by the State Law Enforcement Division of any criminal conduct. Well, that's part of it. Again, in South Carolina, you can be civilly liable but not criminally negligent. It's a difference. But as this case proceeds, Judge Hall has indicated that he will issue a ruling within the next 3 weeks on whether or not Parkers will be tossed from this case. And this is significant because Parkers, people, is where the money is. That is where the money is. If they are tossed off this case, all of a sudden Attorney Mark Tinsley is left going after the Murdaughs. And he's already settled with several Murdoch family members, including Buster Murdoch, the estate of the late Maggie Murdoch. So those deals already done. It is Parkers or bust for Attorney Mark Tinsley, and we will find out within the next few weeks whether or not that case will go to trial with Parkers as one of the defendants. There was also another debate, though, that was heard in Judge Hall's court this past week, and it involves an effort by Alec Murdaugh's attorneys, Jim Griffin and Dick Harpootlian, to secure another $160,000 from Murdaugh's assets to pay for his appeal. Now, Griffin and Harpootlian were previously successful in securing $600,000 for use at the recent double homicide trial to defend Alec Murdaugh, the hiring of expert witnesses. And I don't know, if you watch that trial, I don't think they got their money on those expert witnesses because, folks, the prosecution did an amazing job of cross-examining those defense experts and really calling into question their version of that crime scene in the double homicide case. But nonetheless, that was money that Alec Murdaugh secured through cashing out his 401k. Judge Hall allowed him to use that for his defense, and we will find out within the next week and a half. Judge Hall is going to rule very quickly on whether that $160,000 ought to go to Alec Murdaugh's attorneys as they prepare his appeal. So again, some big developments in that civil case. We still don't have a date yet for that trial, folks. It was originally scheduled for January this year. Judge Hall pushed it back because of the double homicide case. Then it was scheduled for April, but one of the Parkers' attorneys, powerful South Carolina Speaker of the House Merle Smith, invoked his legislative immunity, which means he did not have to appear in court. This is, again, another one of these sops that our judiciary gives to powerful lawyer legislators. They can literally dictate when they do and do not appear in court. Just another travesty in our system, people, that allows those who pick the judges to exert improper influence over the judges. But in this case, Judge Hall had no choice. That legislative immunity is in the law. There's nothing they can do about it. So until we fix that, again, we're going to continue to see powerful lawyer legislators manipulate the system. But hopefully we're going to get a trial date very soon on this boat crash case, because this family, folks, has been waiting, again, since 2019 for justice. And we have been waiting that long to find out just how deep the cover-up went involving the Murdaugh family. And by the way, there is still a pending statewide grand jury investigation into obstruction of justice related to this boat crash. So while there may not be criminal consequences for Parkers, there could be criminal consequences for Murdaugh family members. And also, I do want to remind people, we have heard a lot about injustice in South Carolina, about prosecutors, judges not doing their jobs. But I do want to remind our audience that the Office of South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson, in the aftermath of that boat crash, under immense pressure, they charged Paul Murdaugh 3 counts, felony boating under the influence, including one resulting in death. He was facing up to 30 years in prison. And not only that, Wilson's office, particularly Prosecutor Megan Berkstead, pushed hard to make sure that there was no sweetheart plea deal for Paul Murdaugh. They were going to make him do time, people. They were going to make him do time. And in fact, some believe that that prospect of him doing time may have been in Alec Murdaugh's mind on the night of those tragic murders. But nonetheless, they did their job, and so I do want to point that out. We hear a lot about injustice in South Carolina. We see it every day, but it's nice to see those examples where prosecutors do their job. Again, count on FITSNews to keep you up to speed on the very latest related to these many, many Murdaugh sagas. And once again, always keep it tuned to us to get the perspective of the truth, not picking one side or the other. We lay it out and let you decide. All right, so in our next segment this week, a tragedy on Folly Beach, South Carolina, a wedding that ended in just an unspeakable horror. The story of Eric Hutchinson and Samantha Miller, newlyweds who literally had just minutes together before their life together was shattered by a drunk driver. Our research director, Jen Wood, penned an incredible story on this past week. Jen's joining us now. Thanks, Jen, for hopping online with us here.
Of course, anytime.
This is just a heartbreaking story, Jen. Walk us through some of the details of this night, April 28th, last week on Folly Beach. What exactly happened, Jen?
Yeah, so Samantha Miller and Eric Hutchinson had just gotten married on Folly Beach. She is from North Carolina. He's from Utah. They had been together for 3 years and had said their vows, had their reception at a pavilion on the beach. They left under the glow of sparklers held by their family and friends, got into a golf cart, which is a popular way of getting around on Folly Beach with a just married sign on the back, and they were blocks away from their Airbnb where they were staying when a drunk driver hit them going 65 miles an hour, more than double the speed limit.
Right, that's East Ashley. That's a 25-mile-an-hour zone down there on Folly.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, Folly Beach, just south of Charleston, South Carolina, very popular location. That pavilion down there on the south end of the island, very popular for weddings. Jen, let's walk us through what are the charges. First of all, tell us a little bit about the suspect in this case, the charges. What's the current status of the criminal inquiry?
So the suspect is 25-year-old Jamie Komorowski. She is originally from New Jersey but attended Coastal Carolina University. She was charged with 4 counts, one of reckless homicide, and then 3 counts of driving under the influence, causing great bodily injury.
Mm-hmm.
So very sad. She is currently held without bail in the Charleston County Detention Center.
And apparently under suicide watch. She told the responding officers that she wanted to kill herself at one point. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
So was reading a little bit of the incident report following this, that it appears that the golf cart was pushed over 100 yards, that it flipped multiple times, that all 4 of the occupants were ejected from the vehicle. Samantha Miller was found on the scene, dead, Jen, in her wedding dress.
And her new husband, Eric, sustained head injuries, and then the people that were driving them, Eric's brother-in-law and nephew, also sustained serious injuries. So it was a catastrophic accident.
Mm-hmm. And then there's Eric's mother has put a GoFundMe page up, which describes some of the surgeries he's going to have to undergo. One of them was undertaken in the immediate aftermath of this crash. He's got another surgery upcoming, a lengthy rehabilitation, but obviously none of that even touches the fact he just lost the love of his life moments after getting married. Jen, let's pivot from this case for a moment, and we want to talk about another eerily similar drunk driving case that took place in downtown Charleston, January 2019. This is the Cade Garris case, in which this individual driving a Ford F-150 runs a solid red light, slams into another car. That car then slams into a building in downtown Charleston. A similar situation. There were 4 people in that vehicle. One of those individuals died as a result of that crash. But we found out this past week that there were some efforts by, once again, here we go again, lawyer legislators in South Carolina. One of his attorneys, Cade Garris' attorneys, a lawyer legislator, and there were some apparent efforts to try and pick a judge favorable to defendants in these cases. Jen, tell us a little bit about this story.
So the, judicial shenanigans, I guess that's the best way to put it, but his attorneys, the late David Ayler and Dion Tedder, were working to negotiate a guilty plea deal in front of, and their goal was to hear that plea in front of Judge Bentley Price, who wasn't scheduled to hear cases in that district that day. The court pushed back, and they heard it in front of Judge Bond. Mm-hmm. And all of those communications were filed as part of a sentence appeal filed by Garris's new attorney.
He's effectively arguing that they couldn't get me in front of the right judge to get me off on that.
Right, exactly.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, it's unusual that you do see communications between attorneys and their clients because they are protected as attorney-client privilege. But in this case, because the defendant had filed the motion, he included those communications as evidence of him not understanding the plea deal that he was making.
It was a rare glimpse, like you said, into sort of the inner workings of these efforts that lawyer legislators undertake. And in fact, Jen, just a few weeks ago, we did a piece, your Freedom of Information Act request, from some jailhouse calls up in York County, where we were able to hear a defendant and his mother discussing another example of these efforts to try to get these cases in front of judges who are friendly with certain lawmakers or who they are believed to be more lenient to these types of defendants. But Jen, it's a broken system, isn't it?
It's absolutely a broken system. It's flawed. It needs reform terribly bad. And, people are starting to pay attention. I mean, you've been screaming from the rooftops for years that the system is inherently flawed. And, with the recent release of Jared Price and the Supreme Court's decision to overrule that release, and now we've got a fugitive on the run, there's just example after example of how this goes bad when we don't have transparency in our judiciary system.
Well, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to bring this up in the context of this case, because, folks, you think about it, if you are this 25-year-old girl sitting in jail facing potential bond hearings down the road, facing a potential plea agreement, Jen Wood, who are you hiring if you're this woman?
I'm going to hire a legislator who can negotiate the best deal with the judges that they appoint. I mean, that is if you can afford that kind of representation and that kind of clout, that's where you're going to go.
Absolutely. And once again, it has nothing to do with fairness, nothing to do with public safety, nothing to do with the rights of victims. It's all who you know. But Jen, I wanted to thank you for your work on this piece. This is a story that made national headlines, that attracted national attention. Clearly just an egregious incident. And I wanted to get us on it to make sure that people knew that not only do we want to tell that story, but we want to ensure that the South Carolina justice system does its job in this case, and that we do not see the sort of chicanery or attempted chicanery that we saw in the case of Thomas Cade Garris. So, Jen, thank you for your amazing work on that. Just a tragic story. Let's hope that these folks get the justice they deserve and not the justice that is so often doled out by the South Carolina system. Thank you, Jen Wood.
You're very welcome. And we'll be following it just to make sure that happens.
Absolutely, we will. Jen Wood, not only did she write that story, did all the research on it, and as I mentioned, has been driving our FOIA efforts to make sure that these lawyer-legislator ploys do not go unexposed, that you are able to see exactly how this system works. Jen, amazing work. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so Will is gone. Jennifer Wood is still here. And it is quite possible that we have the biggest and most important development in the Cheer Incorporated saga from the media and publicity side. There's been a new lawsuit filed naming the Navarro College, which was the subject of the Netflix Cheer documentary. So this puts an intense spotlight on this saga of lawsuits. However, there are many things that ring true and ring similar to what we've seen before. Jennifer, do you want to talk a little bit about the specifics of this lawsuit, and then maybe we can talk about how this has gained more traction than other suits and might affect the course of this litigation going forward?
Sure. So for those that are unfamiliar with Navarro, Navarro's a junior college that's based in Texas, Corsicana, Texas. And it was the focus of the recent Netflix docuseries Cheer, which is kind of what brought the sport of cheerleading, specifically all-star and collegiate cheerleading, into the spotlight recently, and gave people a good sense of, what it truly is, how hard these athletes work. It also is the team that Jerry Harris was on, who became very popular during the course of the series, and then was indicted for allegations of child sex abuse, to which she pled guilty and is now in federal prison for. Monica Aldama is the head coach of Navarro, and she's a very public figure. We've seen her since the show started on Dancing with the Stars. She's a renowned coach with a storied program. They've won tons of national championships. They are highly regarded in the cheerleading industry, and that was even before the documentary came out. So this lawsuit named both Navarro Junior College and Monica Aldama, the coach, in it, and it's from a former athlete named Maddie Lane, who was allegedly sexually assaulted in September of 2021 by a fellow Navarro teammate. So I think the key, when you read these complaints, you're kind of looking, a lot of times with this story, you see a lot of similarities in what's being alleged in the complaints when they're filed. This one specifically was difficult to read because she, it looks like Maddie, the athlete, had truly, she had been trying to report this. She reported it to her teammates. She reported it to her coach. She reported it to the Title IX office at the college. She reported it to authorities. And every step of the way, she was met with hurdles, pushbacks, and it was difficult to read how hard it was for her to get this report through the system.
It's very tough to me. The thing that struck me the most was not the adults who have financial interests in her not talking, encouraging her to not talk, but it was her peers who don't have that perverse financial interest. They're not jaded adults yet. And yet there's still that commitment to this perverse team mentality that allegedly that they were telling her to shut up for the good of the team, saying that the school would shut them down.
Yeah, don't tell the coach, it will stress her out. Don't tell the school because they will shut the team down. And everybody will know it's because of you and they'll hate you. And I mean, just a concerted effort to ensure this young woman did not tell her story.
Every step of the way.
Mm-hmm. And, looking at the reaction, because there was a lot of reaction to this on social media. A lot of, I call it cheer Twitter because that's what it's referred to. I mean, it is a thing. A lot of the reactions were not surprised by the lawsuit, not surprised by the allegations, not surprised by the response from the university. So, to me, that was another kind of telltale, very sad commentary on the whole story.
Yeah, when you see the insiders saying, well, it's about time, or well, I'm not shocked, it tells you a lot about what people who are within that kind of bubble of knowledge think about that program.
And with stories like this, when you see these, survivors coming forward and telling their stories, and they're so brave, I've found that a lot of times it really is when one person starts coming forward, it ends up being the tip of the iceberg. Other people kind of find their voice, find their strength in, that first person who's brave enough to come forward, which it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Of course, Coach Adama, in a statement that was released, categorically denied the allegations. But, with the Title IX violations that were alleged, I think this is a much bigger deal than people realize.
Yeah, once you get into that Title IX Title IX protections, those federally mandated protections, you're not playing games anymore about slots on a team. At that point, you're talking about violating federal law, and that's when the potential for serious law enforcement oversight is possible. And that's what the school knows.
Right. And the sanctions, the Title IX violations, Title IX applies to any school that's receiving federal funding. And,
which is
the
darn near
sanctions-
every school.
Right. And the sanctions can include loss of federal funding. So it's potentially a huge deal.
Right. When the athletes were talking about the school potentially shutting down a program that brings them titles, they're not talking about that frivolously. It's a serious calculation that a school would make if they think that they don't have control over the propensity of serious risk of sexual assaults happening. They might just shut it down to avoid that Title IX risk. But what I hope that this does, because there's that Netflix show that will fuel this to reach a new, larger audience of many more people within the cheer community and many people outside of it that have just become familiar with this team and with these specific individuals through that show. Mm-hmm. I hope it makes people in the cheer world think, I don't want to be the teammate who is in a lawsuit 5 years from now. I don't want to be the coach who is in the lawsuit 5 years from now. And hopefully just the fact that these suits are getting this level of attention, finally, by the way, might cause some people to change the way that they react the next time that somebody comes forward and says that I was unconsensually sexually touched.
Correct. And, I think it's also important to note that unlike the other lawsuits that we've been covering, neither Varsity nor USASF nor USA Cheer were named defendants in this lawsuit. It was specifically against Navarro Junior College and Coach Aldama.
And it's interesting because although they're not named defendants, this feels as though it takes the temperature up in that series of lawsuits that names them as a defendant, just because it brings a whole new heightened level of public pressure to the table here.
Yeah, I agree. I'm never happy to see new complaints filed, new survivors alleging abuse, but sometimes when you see a higher profile lawsuit filed like this, when a story is not getting the amount of coverage that I truly think this is a very widespread problem within the cheerleading industry. So when you see a story that might elevate the coverage to a more national level, it is a good thing.
It's a two-edged sword every time, from a journalistic perspective, you see one of these filings, because on the one hand, it's going to be an absolute gut punch reading it. You're going to want to, you remember how just viscerally angry I was for a couple of hours after reading this lawsuit and our initial reporting on it. But also, it has the potential to make a long-term difference that might prevent the kinds of things that are alleged to have happened in this suit from happening in the future. So, that's why we put in the work that we do and why we're going to continue to ride this story as far as it will go.
Right. Yeah, we're just going to keep following it and keep supporting, the survivors that are reporting, and also giving, offering a microphone to those that are accused. I think that's also important, as in addition
accusations are just accusations.
Right. Exactly. These are all alleged crimes, alleged, allegations within a civil complaint. So that's very important to remember. But, in addition to giving survivors a voice, FITSNews has an open microphone policy. And if somebody wants to come forward, we are happy to hear their side of the story.
All right, so the 2024 presidential season is starting to heat up. Candidates coming into South Carolina to woo our early voters here in the Palmetto State. We are first in the South on the Republican side, first in the country on the Democratic side. But this past week, we had the opportunity to sit down with one of those candidates. And I'm referring, of course, to multimillionaire entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, if you haven't heard of this guy before, and again, I'd heard of him, I wasn't sure I could say his name correctly, ended up clearing that hurdle. But this is one of the more substantive candidates that I've ever interviewed. And again, he's got sound bites, so let's get that out of the way. He's very good at doling out the red meat through sound bites, the woke industrial complex that he's fighting. He brands himself as the CEO of anti-woke. So there's some spin there. But within that spin, what I found in my conversation with Vivek Ramaswamy was a very substantive, issues-based candidate, whether we're talking about school choice, we're talking about eliminating deficit spending, reducing the national debt, entitlements, dismantling the administrative state. He had some very specific policy planks on that. But when you watch our interview with him, which aired on FITSNews this past Tuesday morning, is when we dropped that interview. You watch that. Within all that spin and the sound bites, there are some really substantive policy positions. But here, let's cut real quick. This is an excerpt from that interview I wanted to cut to. Let's listen to Vivek Ramaswamy.
I don't do political calculus in what I say. Okay, I'm going to speak truth as I see it. I will call it as I see it. I would rather lose this election and speak truth at every step of the way than to somehow win by playing a game of political snakes and ladders. I happen to think, if you ask me, I think the winning electoral strategy is to speak truth. But either way, that's what I'm going to be doing. So, I don't know if that's good for me politically or not. But
again, speaking the truth, folks, that's what it's all about. And again, whether you agree, disagree with all of the policy positions, at least credit this guy for being, again, one of the more substantive candidates we've sat down with in this contest. Now, as this race continues to heat up, count on FITSNews, our open mic, always open to any of these candidates. In fact, we're hoping to sit down at some point with U.S. Senator Tim Scott, who is jumping in the race on May 22nd. He's got a big event scheduled in North Charleston, South Carolina. Scott will become the second South Carolina politician to enter the presidential race following former Palmetto State Governor Nikki Haley. Certainly we want to try to hear from former President Donald Trump, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, making a big push. In fact, DeSantis, his PACs have been very active in South Carolina, dropping all sorts. Text bombardment. I've gotten like about 6 text messages from DeSantis within the last 24 hours, people. I mean, they are really working those text threads. But the race clearly starting to heat up. We're clearly entering that pivotal phase of that election where candidates jockeying for position, looking to get some boat speed, get some wind at their backs as they court this incredibly important South Carolina electorate. Again, whether you're on the Democratic side or the Republican side. And it's worth pointing out, incumbent Joe Biden, he's got a challenger. 2 challengers, actually. One of them, the son of the late Robert F. Kennedy. Yeah, that's right, people. RFK Jr. in this race officially now, making some noise. And this is a candidate very unconventional. Got that Kennedy name and some very populist positions, very big on anti-vax, which is going to be very interesting because a lot of the spin on vaccines and masks, folks, it's falling apart. We're actually going to have a big story about that coming up on FITSNews. But for all your First in the South presidential coverage and coverage of state politics, keep it tuned to FITSNews. We got you covered. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review. Before we go, just a reminder, we've been talking politics here. I want to remind folks to check out every week our Palmetto Political Stock Index. And yes, look at that gorgeous graphic, Dylan Nolan. That is beautiful, man. So look at that. I want to play that again. Do that again. God, that's gorgeous. Look at that. FITSNews people bringing it to the next level. Once again, though, for all your political news, keep it tuned here. Thanks for tuning in this week. We will catch you next week on your Week in Review.